when I wanted to be so right.
I'd have to say that ducking and covering combined with gamma super strength from an experiment gone wrong might protect you from an atomic bomb. Otherwise, well, I'm not sure that it's really that effective. But people thought that it was. By the way, if you don't get that reference, gamma strength is the source of Bruce Banner's power before, so it transforms him into the Incredible Hulk. Marvel Comics thrived in the 1960s on how radiation gone wrong could transform you into a superhero. And so almost every Marvel superhero in the early 1960s was transformed into a superhero through radioactive means. The Fantastic Four, cosmic rays, the Amazing Spider-Man, a radioactive spider bites Peter Parker, and the Incredible Hulk, of course, Bruce Banner experiments with gamma rays, and it ends up going wrong or going right, depending on your perspective, whether you enjoy Bruce Banner or the Hulk more, or, well, spoiler alert, you can experience the combined version in Avengers Endgame. There's a great little clip from a Family Guy show a few years ago where the Family Guy characters get superpowers, and Adam West is the mayor at that time, and Adam West thinks, hey, I want to be a superhero too. So he goes to a toxic waste dump and puts toxic waste all over himself and basically gets cancer. He doesn't become a superhero in the book. It's the thought that counts. He was trying. He was aspiring. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you feel like your atomic readiness education has been furthered by watching this Defense Department video. If not, Professor Fessler, we can talk to him into giving you some drills where you can actually practice ducking and covering so that you will be equipped to survive any sort of nuclear holocaust that may come. If you think that this is an effective strategy for dealing with the events of a nuclear attack, then I encourage you to watch Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And that's a more accurate depiction of what happens when a nuclear weapon is dropped. The desk probably doesn't offer a whole lot of protection. When I was a kid, in 6th grade, we had this English teacher who was a very interesting character. She was a very unreconstructed flower child. She had had her radical heyday in the late 60s, and she'd never quite grown out of it. And she terrified us with the possibilities of nuclear apocalypse. This is like 1985. The Cold War is very, very hot at this point in time. American movies are taunting the Russians all the time. We're like sending teenagers over an Iron Eagle to take the Russians down. Rocky's beating up Ivan Drago. So the Russians are ticked because we're having a good time with them in all of our movies. And this teacher, her name was Mrs. Bryant. She would give us these horrific scenarios of what would happen if there was a nuclear attack. We were an hour and a half away from Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is where some of our best fighters were. And she would be like, you know, if they decided to bomb, they would bomb Barksdale Air Force Base and eliminate the U.S. Air Force's fighting capability. And we're only an hour and a half away. The fallout would come across to Ruston and to Bernice, and you'd have nuclear waste and fallout all over the place. And we're in sixth grade, and we're sitting there like, but I don't want to die yet. You know, there's so many things I haven't done. I want to see the next season of Different Strokes. You know, it's very terrifying. And she's just loading it on. We had this dress up day, and a couple of us dressed up as Army characters because that was the big deal. That G.I. Joe was the thing, not the inferior movies that were made a few years ago, but the original cartoon, which, you know, was a classic at the time. So some of us came dressed up as military characters. She came dressed up as an anti-war protester for the Vietnam era, and she had her sign, "Make love, not war," and all that. And she was very much playing up her 60s persona. Well, she didn't come back the next school year. Over the summer, her contract was mysteriously not renewed. And then we started to hear stories about how she was growing exotic plants in her backyard and the supposed some legal complications for her, as well as professional complications. So we lost Miss Bryant at our little school, but the memory is still there. So in many ways, she was carrying on the traditions of the 1960s, Cheech and Chong style. You don't know what I mean by Cheech and Chong style? Check it out. It's funny. But check out the video. Don't check out the Cheech and Chong lifestyle. York University does not endorse the Cheech and Chong lifestyle. Very quickly, have that disclaimer. But the little vans, the Volkswagen vans, forever, I associate those with two things. Either drug use from Cheech and Chong because they pop the back doors of that van open and marijuana smoke just wafts out, or terrorism because of Back to the Future, the original Back to the Future. We call them terrorist vans whenever I went to college because that was the image we had for Back to the Future. Well, welcome to the late 20th century. We're at the midpoint right now, and we're about to enter a new and interesting age, a dangerous age. After one great war at the beginning of the century, and now a second war equally, actually more devastating, the end of that war is going to bring closure to one set of problems, but it's going to open up an entirely new set of concerns that are going to be dominating people's focus throughout the latter part of the 20th century. Let's end one conflict, and let's talk about how the resolution of that conflict leads to this new atmosphere, the atmosphere we often refer to as the, quote, Cold War, a new and very complicated period in human history. We had left things with the Allies triumphant in North Africa. Through the work of Bernard Montgomery and George S. Patton, they had been able to push Erwin Rommel out of North Africa, and they crossed the Mediterranean Sea and did exactly what they planned to do, which is take back Mussolini's Italy. Mussolini's regime is going to collapse. Mussolini himself is going to be killed by his own people who have been wanting to rebel against his rule for a while. And once the opening is presented, they're going to take their vengeance on he and his inner circle. So brutally, he is hung in the streets along with his inner circle. And when the Allies complete their conquest of Italy, they now have an open road to strike at Germany from the south. Remember that we discussed how the whole point of this operation was to put them in a place where they could weaken Germany in the center to make it easier, hopefully, to invade from the west. So now that they've created this opening and they're putting pressure on Hitler from the south, they are now ready to engage in operations to try to take Europe back. One of the most ambitious invasion plans in military history is launched on June the 6th, 1944. The code name is Operation Overlord, but it comes to be known afterwards as D-Day. This is a very ambitious invasion of France, meant to bring that region back into the Allied fold and start pushing the Germans back towards their own territory. It is a hard-fought campaign. Like I said, if you really want an image of what this was like on the ground, at least as close as we can get from the distance we are from it, Saving Private Ryan has got that beach scene at the beginning that, according to many veterans, captures to a large degree what it was like, the violence, the struggle, how up in the air it seemed at first when they hit the beaches. They do manage to establish beachheads there, and from that point, they painstakingly are going to fight their way across the terrain of France, heading towards Paris. At this point, the Nazis' hold on France begins to weaken, and they find themselves retreating bit by bit. Remember, we talked about that railroad car that they signed the surrender of World War I in, and then when the Germans marched into France, they forced the French to sign their surrender at the beginning of World War II in that railroad car. The Nazis destroy that railroad car at this point because it's obvious they're about to lose, and they refuse to sign any more papers inside that railroad car. So they destroy it, and then they start to retreat. By December of 1944, the Allies have pushed them to the edge of Allied territory, and the Germans now have their backs to their own border. And it's at this moment that they try something very audacious. They are going to drop paratroopers behind Allied lines who have been rigorously trained in how to impersonate American and British officers. And then, having dropped those paratroopers, they launch an offensive designed to keep the Allies out of German territory. The conflict is called the Battle of the Bulge. It happens on December 14th, 1944. It's called the Battle of the Bulge, not because they're adopting a new weight loss plan, though that's what it sounds like, but because they're trying to create a bulge or a pocket in the Allied lines and using that push them backwards away from German territory. And what makes this even more difficult for the Allies, one, they weren't anticipating it. Two, they've got these Trojan horses behind their lines. You'll have like a tank team pull into a refueling depot and jump out and ask the guys at the refueling depot to refuel their tanks. And the guys will say, yeah, sure, we'll do that. How you doing, pal? You know, hey, you read Life magazine lately? You know, they'll be dropping all these cultural idioms, and everybody's comfortable, everyone's relaxed, and then suddenly these guys produce weapons and they try to kill the tank crew. They're German operatives disguised as American and British soldiers. And so they have sown confusion up and down the Allied lines by dropping these people behind Allied lines and getting them to pose as Allied soldiers. It takes a while to sort out what's going on, and then longer to try to contain these operatives who are behind Allied lines, while at the same time trying to resist the German push that is heavily focused on the center of the Allied line to create that aforementioned bulge and use it as a means of forcing the Allies back. It is a pretty desperate battle. It's probably one of the last really great battles of the war in terms of big, complicated. At the end of the day, the Allies are able to hold their position and push the Germans back, but they spend days mopping up afterwards trying to locate all of the operatives behind Allied lines that are attempting to sow confusion. It's an absolute mess. So this is kind of the last great push. This is the last really energetic attempt by the Nazis to break the coming Allied advance. You remember that one of Hitler's big problems at the end of World War I was that he felt the Germans had surrendered too early. Hitler is going to go in exactly the opposite direction. It is very apparent that everything is falling apart. It is obvious throughout the spring of 1944 the German war effort is collapsing. But Hitler seems determined that Germany is going to die with him, and he is not going to surrender until every last vestige of German capability is wiped out. And so this time the Allies do march into Germany. They do start advancing towards Berlin, and German territory is very quickly falling under their control. Also, not only are the Allies marching in from the west, but after about 2 years of the Germans fighting in Soviet territory, the Soviets are pushing back from the other direction as well. And the Soviets do not have some of the same moral restrictions that the Allies have. The Allies are operating according to the Geneva Convention. They are attempting to engage in warfare in what are generally accepted ways of doing so. The Russians are also part of the Allied movement, but they have no such moral compunctions. As they start marching back, they are enraged because of German atrocities on their home territory. And so as they march through Soviet territory, push the Germans back through Poland, they are exacting revenge in every way they possibly can. So once they enter German territory from the east, they are ripping Germany apart. And so you've got Germany's worst nightmare. The British, the French, and the Americans coming from the west, British, the French, and Americans coming from the south, and to the east, the Soviets are pouring into German territory. So there is no possibility that Hitler can win this, and yet he continues to hold out. In the latter months of the spring of 1944, in March and April, he retreats underground. He's got a bunker constructed under the city of Berlin, and he retreats there with his staff, his inner circle, and his fiancee, soon-to-be wife, Eva Braun. He's got lookalikes running around the city. It's almost comical. He's got all kinds of characters made up to look like him to try to throw the pursuit away from where he is actually hiding. The Russians in their archives have got pictures of Russian soldiers standing around a body that looks like Hitler's, and they're trying to determine if it's actually him or not. And in the end, they determine it's one of his doubles that had been killed in one of the bombing attacks. And they run across the body, and they're hoping it's Hitler, but it's not. This sows such confusion that after the war, the Soviets are the ones who know the most about what happened to Hitler because they got to Berlin first. We'll talk about that in just a minute. There was actually a deal forged between Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin that the Allies from the West would allow the Soviets to come into Berlin first. The argument was that the Soviets had suffered the worst destruction on their home territory, so the other Allies should let them come in first. Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to that. Also, Eisenhower signed off on it. This is one case in point where George S. Patton was actually a voice of wisdom. Patton says, don't let them do that. If you let them come in first, they'll never leave Eastern Europe. And a lot of the Allies said, hey, you're just overreacting, calm down. Well, in this case, he is absolutely correct. Stalin is already laying the foundations for his imposition of the Iron Curtain after World War II. He's already planning to try to stay in Eastern Europe if he possibly can. So that's why they come in first. Well, they're going to be the ones, because they come in first, who will discover most of the remnants of Hitler's regime. They will discover the bunker where on April the 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide. On April the 30th, 1945, having finally realized that every last one of his central commanders had capitulated, he goes into a private room with Eva Braun, who he has just married, and says, okay, we're going to take our own lives. Poor Eva Braun had been his mistress for about 15 years or so, since the very late 1920s. He had basically kept her as a mistress without marrying her. And then right here at the very end, he marries her. He's like, okay, honey, for our honeymoon, let's have a suicide pact. It's sick stuff. They end up taking their lives together. And also his deputy chief propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, the guy that we talked about previously, who was such a proponent of the big lie theory. Goebbels was also in the bunker along with his wife and their young children. And Goebbels poisons his entire family. They all take poison, including the family dog. It's just sick stuff. They've decided they're not going to be captured. And so he poisons his entire family, including himself. Hitler dies by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. That's the official story. Now, the problem is that once Hitler shoots himself, his subordinates in the bunker drag the body out and they attempt to burn it completely. They don't succeed in absolutely eradicating it. So there are fragments discovered. But again, this is before DNA testing. And so we don't have the ability to test the remains like we do now. And we don't actually know where the remains are because they were in Soviet hands. Whatever was left seems to have gotten lost. So this meant, of course, that conspiracy theorists around the world advanced the possibility in the immediate years afterward that somehow Hitler might have survived. And it was such a weird situation, and there were so many devils at play, that even Joseph Stalin, who should know better than anyone, was paranoid that somehow Hitler might have tricked everyone and suddenly come back. There are rumors about him in Latin America. There were a lot of Nazis that fled to Argentina. And so rumors abounded that maybe in Mexico or Argentina, Hitler might be hiding out. And Stalin, until he died in 1953, would often investigate these claims just to be sure that Hitler wasn't active out there somewhere. As far as we know, Hitler's dark story ends on April the 30th. For all the conspiracy theories and rumors, there's never been any credible evidence that he survived what happened. And in fact, at that point, he had nothing left to live for except to defiantly try to elude judgment for his crimes, because by then, everything had fallen apart. Berlin was a burned out husk. His fighting capability was gone, and his top generals had begun to surrender. They had been calling on him to do that, to preserve Germany for weeks, and he kept refusing to heed their calls. And so one by one, his chief lieutenants started surrendering themselves and offering the Allies concessions. So Hitler ultimately is going to end up dying, and within a few days, peace is going to be declared. With Hitler gone, the Germans come to the negotiating table, and by May 7th, there's been a declaration of an end of hostilities. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, is proclaimed on May the 8th, 1945. So one front of the war has now been extinguished with the defeat of Nazi Germany. However, it is only as they enter into German territory that the Allies fully realize the total cost of Hitler's regime. My grandfather served in the European theater in World War II. He was a member of George S. Patton's Third Army in North Africa. He idolized Patton. I think I told you previously, you cannot say a bad thing about George Patton without him going ballistic. So we never did. He was always a huge fan of Patton and his legacy, and he would always challenge any of Patton's detractors. He would never talk about World War II, never, when I was growing up. And it was really frustrating for me because, as you might have discerned, I'm a little bit interested in history, and I always have been from my earliest years. And, you know, they often joke that the Civil War and World War II are the gateway drugs for every budding historian. And there's some truth to that. If you go to the bookstore, those are the two biggest sections in the history section, the World War II and the Civil War section. So I was always fascinated by those periods. And those were periods that I looked into long before any of the other periods that I studied that I became interested in history. I can still remember, I was probably 7 years old, maybe 8 years old. One of the first more extensive history books that I read, it was a book about the Civil War. And I understood nothing about the Civil War, absolutely nothing. And nothing about the dynamics of slavery or all the other things that surrounded it. I'm just reading a book as an ignorant kid. And as I start reading the book, my parents are driving and I'm in the back seat. And they're like, "So what are you reading?" I said, "It's a book about the Civil War. It's like the North is fighting the South." And my parents are like, "Oh, really? Who do you think's going to win that?" or whatever. And I had not read anything yet. And I'm like, "Oh, well, we live in the South, so I guess maybe the South is going to." And I can still remember, you know how your parents are carrying on a conversation, they're kind of having a little chuckle at your expense, and you pick up on it, you know, that they're kind of laughing at you a little bit. You see them kind of chuckling up front. They said, "Oh, well, good. Well, let us know how it goes, you know, how it unfolds." And of course, well, as you might imagine, I learned some things about my local culture that were interesting, to say the least, of the outcome of that conflict. And with the World War II stuff, I was really fascinated in it. And my grandfather was a living connection to that. And so I really wanted to talk about it desperately. And he just never did. He never would. It was just something that he would not mention. And for years, it was like that. And two things probably broke the logjam. And this was not until I was like out of college. I had graduated from college and I was, you know, working towards my master's at that point. And he, one, had a cancer scare, which turned out not to be as bad as they thought it was going to be, but he was thinking he was going to die. And the other thing was that his old unit had a reunion. And because of the cancer scare, because he came so close to, you know, thinking he was going to die, he wanted to see those guys again. And so he went to the reunion. And something about all of that together kind of broke the logjam, and it made him willing to start talking about all that. So he started bringing out his old medals, and he would bring out this journal that he had kept during the time. It was like a wealth of stuff that I had never seen. It was fascinating. And we'd sit there, we'd talk about his time in Europe and this period when he's marching with the Allied armies towards Berlin. And I mean, he described things that are just incredible that he saw in combat, like they're crossing the Rhine River in a boat. And he's talking to this guy, and there's a German sniper on the opposite bank who fires and shoots this guy like right in front of him. He's there at the Battle of the Bulge, and he saw a lot of what went on there. And he's describing all this stuff. And I finally asked him one day, I said, why, did you go so many years without talking about this stuff? Was the PTSD, or I didn't use that term, we weren't using it as much then, but, were the scars from combat just so bad that you didn't want to talk about it or whatever? And he got really quiet. And then he said, the worst part about it was not the stuff that we experienced in battle. That was horrible. But he said the thing that I didn't want to think about, that I never wanted to go back to, was what we found in those camps. And that's when he started kind of getting into the story of how, as they're marching across Germany, they start to encounter these camps that were billed as labor camps. But as they entered into them, they found these emaciated people and started to uncover the full extent of Hitler's, quote, final solution. This is the Nazi code name for the Holocaust. It was an industrialized, mechanized, specific plan to wipe out an entire race of people. And it didn't just include Jews, there were others as well, but the Jewish people were the primary targets. These Jews who had been rounded up in the early years of the war, they were sent to these camps, which sometimes were labor camps, but very often they ended up becoming extermination camps where the goal was not to just extract labor, but to basically diminish the Jewish population. The Allies coming from the West started to discover these things in the western part of Germany. It was even worse in the East. Some of the worst extermination camps were in the east of Germany and in Poland, which means that the Soviets discovered a lot of them. And as they began to uncover them, even the Soviets were very moved by what they saw and angered. And so it makes this sort of vengeance quest the Soviets are on even worse. They really begin to tear up German territory in response to what they're seeing in the camps. 6 million Jews, we estimate, were exterminated in World War II. They would arrive at one of these extermination camps and they would be separated. Women would go one way, men would go the other way. They would have to strip down and divest themselves of their belongings, including any rings or jewelry, any personal possessions they had. They would often go into rooms where they are shaved, and even the hair of these people is kept and is later used for things like making ropes. It's almost like somebody on the Great Plains killing a buffalo. Native Americans will talk about how every piece of the animal was used. Well, everything that these people possessed and that they were is reduced to raw material to be used by the Nazis, including their hair, all of their possessions. They are then led into these large chambers. And what they are told is, you're going to be showered off because you have to be cleansed to prevent disease from pervading the camp. And so they may or may not believe that, depending on how much they had heard already. They go into these rooms, the door is closed, there are shower heads on the walls. You hear the sound of the machinery starting up outside. And then instead of water, Zyklon B gas is pumped through these shower heads. And these masses of people gather together, suffocated with this noxious gas. Once it is done, the doors are opened and these piles of bodies are simply pushed out the door and they are taken to these gigantic furnaces where they are incinerated. Thousands upon thousands, eventually 6 million people are killed in this grisly manner. It is basically the application of industrial technology to the extermination of a people group. And that's probably what has made it such a horrifying picture of human history. Like as debates have ensued in more recent years, some people have pointed out, well, you had large numbers of people killed by Stalin in Siberia. You had the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 1970s who exterminated large numbers of people. You've got the exterminations that have gone on in Africa. Hutu and Tutsi people waged in conflict with each other. And that's true. I mean, you can even point to larger numbers in some places. But what is really, I think, sort of given the Holocaust such a prominent and terrifying place in history is the systematized way it was carried out, the intentionality of it, the planning of it. And it's actually a transcript of a meeting in 1942 where Nazi leaders are sitting around discussing the final solution, as they call it. It's chilling. They are talking about disposing of human beings and basically plundering their bodies as if you're planning like a campus retreat or something like that. They're sitting there laying out the plans for this, and it's just cold, it's calculated, it's mechanical, it's inhuman. You had experiments being conducted on people in these camps. One of the most infamous Nazi doctors was a guy named Joseph Mengele, who was conducting all kinds of experiments on people with either mental illness or birth defects, or just people that they thought were unusual in some way. He ends up escaping at the end of the war, and they later find him hiding out in Latin America. So there's also this going on. And sadly, we actually knew at the highest levels that it was going on before the end of the conflict. If you've ever seen the recent movie with Benedict Cumberbatch that talks about the breaking of the Enigma code, I can't remember the title of it right now. It's about the Bletchley Circle code breakers in London. They had actually been able to decode the Nazi codes, and they were monitoring Nazi traffic. And as early as 1942, they had discovered that these death camps existed. And there was a huge conversation that went on at the highest circles of Allied command about what they should do. And some people proposed that they send in bombers to bomb the railroads that served the camps, and in that way maybe restrict the traffic that was flowing to it, prevent people from being carried to the camps. And they really debated it because the big question was, should we do that? And in that way, slow down the process of the death camps? Or should they refrain from doing that because doing it would reveal that we had the access code, that we understood the codes? And so if they discern that, they'll change the codes and they would lose that ability of gathering information. So it's a really, really horrific call. And at the end of the day, they decided to hold off on attacking the camps or the lines leading to them because they felt like this intelligence was valuable enough that they could end the war earlier. And in that way, they hoped lessen the number of people that were going to be killed. So these are the kind of choices that you often have when you're engaged in a conflict like this. It's not good or bad choices, it's bad or worse choices. And this is the one they chose to make during the conflict. We're about to talk about another one. And the end result was the camps continued to operate until the end of the war. One mistake they probably made, they didn't want people to go wild about it. They didn't want to have a lot of pushback about their decision. So they didn't prepare the GIs at all, the soldiers on the ground at all, for what they were going to encounter. High command knew about it. These soldiers didn't. And so one by one, they discover Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, all these horrific death camps. And they are introduced to all this for the first time, face to face. It's horrific. You can see the pictures of the people, how emaciated they are. If you look on the left-hand slide, you can't see it very well because of the brightness of the light, but you notice there are these guys that are lying in these sort of makeshift beds there. If you look on the second row, about 3 people down, there's a young man who's kind of looking out at us from the picture. That is Elie Wiesel, who became one of the most famous chroniclers of the Holocaust. Wiesel wrote a work called Night, which talked about his experiences in the camps, and then he wrote several other works as well. So that's young Elie Wiesel, who was, I think, about 18 or 19 when the camps were liberated. He had gone into the camps as a teenager. He and his father had been there. He lost his mother, he lost his sister, and his father ends up dying. Wiesel is the lone survivor from his family. And of course, you know the story of Anne Frank and her family. So many victims of this very tragic period in European history. Any questions or comments? Questions and or comments? I took an undergraduate class as an upper level history my junior year. It was a really unique class. It was taught by 3 different professors. There was a history professor, a religion professor, and then actually the Jewish rabbi for the local synagogue in Alexandria, Louisiana. He taught alongside them. And it was a class completely devoted to the Holocaust. And it was, on the one hand, one of the most fascinating academic experiences I've ever had, because each of those guys approached different facets of it from their areas of specialization. So it was both fascinating, but it was also one of the most emotionally exhausting classes I ever had. Like, you would go to that class and you would never leave neutral. You were either sad or you were angry or you're just confused, but the kind of things you're being presented with over and over again are just horrific. It was a really tough place to sort of live for an entire semester. I'm really glad I did it, though. It was very rewarding in terms of my understanding of things, sort of deepening my perspective on things. But it was sort of traumatic in a way as well. Just looking over people's shoulders and what they endured during this period was really hard to stomach. Very horrific things. So on the one hand, it was very rewarding. On the other, it was something else to sort of go through that semester as well. Also learned that semester how many professors it actually takes to start a VCR, because they were ordered to show a videotape to us. And it took all three of them tried, all three with PhDs. None of them could get it started. And finally, a sophomore got up there and helped them start the VCR. So you learn very quickly that PhDs can't teach you everything, to say the least. Well, this is where things stood in Europe. And they finally come to a conclusion with an Allied victory. But of course, you will recall, there's still an active fighting force represented by the Japanese in the Pacific. You also may recall all those rosy promises that were made to us about help from our friends to win this battle against the Japanese. They are so exhausted at the end of the European battle that they try, but they do not provide much. So for the most part, it's going to be the U.S. still in the Pacific. Throughout the course of 1943 and 44, the U.S. is gradually pushing across the Pacific, heading towards Japanese territory. The Battle of Midway turns the tide. Battles like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and finally the Battle of Okinawa are going to place us within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. At Iwo Jima, halfway through the battle, Americans are going to raise the American flag on Mount Suribachi, which is one of the pivotal moments in the conflict. And it's actually from that moment when they're raising the flag that you get this famous picture taken by a life photographer. It's probably one of the most famous pictures from World War II. And it's the foundation that provides the image for that monument that stands outside the Pentagon today. That monument's crafted in imitation of this picture. So gradually, painstakingly, and at great cost, the Americans move across the Pacific until finally, by taking Okinawa in April and June of 1945, they are now poised within flying distance of the Japanese homeland, which means now they can consider the possibility of mounting an invasion. Just as that is underway, something occurs which really raises a lot of fundamental questions about where the war effort is going to go. You guys, let's see, you were born about 2001, 2002, many of you. So you may remember George W. Bush a little bit. I don't know how much. Then you remember Barack Obama, and you remember the presidency of Donald Trump. So already in your lifetime, you've had Bush, maybe, you may remember him. Obama, you probably remember pretty well. Trump, you remember. And of course, now you've got Joe Biden. So in that period, in your lifetimes already, you've had about 3 presidents, 4 maybe, that you can remember. For many Americans, especially young Americans who were born in the late 1920s, early 1930s, the only president they could remember was Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the reason for that was because he became president during the Great Depression, 1933, and served 2 full terms. And then just as he was coming to the end of his second term, World War II began. And Roosevelt made the argument that it was not a good time to change leadership. And at this time, there was no rule saying that someone was only limited to 2 terms. That had been the custom because that's what George Washington had done, but there was no absolute rule for that. And so Roosevelt argued that he should be able to run again. He did, and he actually ends up winning. And so he's going to serve a third term. And then later on, the war is still ongoing. And so in 44, he's going to run for a fourth term. That wouldn't be possible now because in the late 50s, they did pass the amendment saying that the president is legally restricted to 2 terms. Despite how it went with Roosevelt, a lot of people thought that is a long time for one person and one party to be in power. And so they do pass the restriction after that, so that now there is an actual limit on how long a president can serve, 2 terms, 2 consecutive terms, and that's it. They can possibly serve 2 non-consecutive terms, but 2 consecutive terms is the limit. So Roosevelt had been president for about 15 years at this point. A lot of very young Americans, they couldn't remember another president. And the ones that could remember the only Iowa person to serve as president, Herbert Hoover. And that didn't go so well. We need to get somebody else elected from Iowa because Herbert Hoover doesn't represent us the best in regard to Iowa presidents. But, you know, some could remember Hoover. There are a lot that could remember anyone before Roosevelt. In April of 1945, Roosevelt is at his vacation home in Georgia, and he suffers a brain hemorrhage, and he dies. And his story is pretty interesting. We could really get into it. You know, you talk about the pervasiveness of social media and all that today. It would be so hard to hide things today, like Franklin Roosevelt's condition. Roosevelt had polio when he was very young, and he was in a wheelchair most of the time. And amazingly, most of the American public had no idea that Roosevelt was confined to a wheelchair most of the time. A lot of people had no idea of the health issues that he had. That's how easy it was back then to cover things up that today, I don't see how you could possibly get away with covering up. But a lot of Americans had no clue that Roosevelt needed the aid of a wheelchair very often, most often, in fact. Upon his death, Americans are presented with an interesting scenario. Roosevelt had had a variety of vice presidents throughout the course of his presidency. And he had gotten a new one in 1944, just as he was being reelected and shortly before his death. His new vice president was a Missouri senator by the name of Harry Truman. Truman did not know Roosevelt very well, and Roosevelt was just getting to know Truman well when he died. And so suddenly, here is Harry Truman presented with leadership of the war and succeeding a man who basically had become an institution, more or less, over the last decade and a half. It is a tall order. To top it off, Truman goes to Roosevelt's funeral. He engages in all the public mourning rituals. He comes back to the White House, and his chief of staff says, "There's somebody here from the Joint Chiefs. They want to see you in the Situation Room." And so he goes downstairs to the Situation Room. There's a group from the Joint Chiefs of Staff standing around the table. They slide a folder across the table, and they say, "This is something we need to make you aware of." The folder is labeled Project Manhattan, or the Manhattan Project. He opens it and begins to read and discovers that the United States has already developed the world's first atomic bomb. They have been working on it throughout the war because they were very aware that other people, including the Soviets and the Nazis, were working on it also. The big difference is the US had actually succeeded in creating one. In 1943, they tested, and it works. This operation had been going on in the New Mexico desert, led by people like J. Robert Oppenheimer and Richard Feynman, a very elite team of physicists and other scientists. And they had managed to explode this weapon and had tested its ability to be used in warfare and had found it to be effective. And so they do the first successful test. Oppenheimer, as he's standing there watching it go off, quotes a passage from the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, which says, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." The capacity of this weapon to wipe out whole cities is incredible and horrific. The fallout from the nuclear waste is just intimidating, to say the least. So these military planners look at Truman and they say, sir, we have this. It works. And pretty much the question is, do you want to use it? Now imagine getting that promotion and stepping into that decision. Have a great couple of days. On Friday, we'll talk about Truman's decision and the world in the aftermath. Have a great couple of days. Let me know if there's anything I can assist you with.